Our tale from Trench Crusade today take us to the Levant, to a hard country of dust, cedar shadow, cracked shrines, and villages that survive only because the front is never far enough away to ignore and never close enough to fully swallow them. It takes us to a road used by pilgrims, deserters, smugglers, and the dead, and to a village where every lantern after sunset burns with the suspicion that someone behind the walls is lying about who they serve. This is the story of a trench pilgrim who came hunting one heretic soul and learned too late for comfort how many others had already slipped into the same darkness. My name is Brother Mathai of the Scorched Road, sworn pilgrim of the Order of the Ember Cross, penitent hunter, bearer of ash and iron, and at the time of these events a lone tracker attached by temporary writ to a new Antioch screening post east of the Levant front. If you know anything of my order, it is likely the worst thing first. People hear Ember Cross and think of smoke, cinders, accusation, and women screaming under a pious sentence. They think of villages forced to kneel in their own dust while our examiners searched charms, cupboards, floorboards, and skin for signs of corruption. They think, not incorrectly, of the 3 women burned at Alcara 6 years before my arrival in this story, and of the black column of smoke that stood over the valley for a day and a night while the locals cursed us with shut mouths and wide eyes. Men like me travel ahead of reputation only in places where nobody has heard the name yet. In the Levant, everyone had heard it. I was 38 years old when I came to the village of Deir el Masra. I had worn the ash-gray wraps and nailed sandals of my order for 14 years, and before that I had been a cooper's son from Accra with good shoulders, bad temper, and a talent for taking guilt and remaking it into obedience. The Order of the Ember Cross likes men like that. It can build a useful instrument from a man who is already half convinced he deserves to be used. My weapon was a long pilgrim's staff of blackened cedar, its iron cap weighted for crushing bone, its hollow core hiding a narrow, blessed spike for work at close quarters. At my belt hung a broad knife, a tinder satchel, 2 glass vials of sanctified oil, a brass censer chain wrapped in cloth, and an old new Antioch revolver with 6 cartridges I guarded more jealously than food. Across my back I carried a carbine taken 3 winters earlier from a dead trench deacon who no longer had use for it. Around my throat were loops of prayer cords stiffened with old sweat, travel grime, and the grease of my fingers counting them in the dark. I tell you these details because the endless war is a war made from details. Fronts do not hold or fail because of banners and speeches. They hold because one hungry man has 3 rounds instead of 2, because one mule path remains open through shell-cracked hills, because one tavern keeper decides to hide old rifles instead of surrendering them to an inspection team. Empires call such things minor. The dead rarely agree. At the new Antioch screen post of St. Barachiel's Spur, I was handed the writ that sent me northeast into the cedar country. The post was little more than a fortified chapel built into terraced stone, its outer wall strengthened with scavenged trench plates, its icon niches darkened by soot and fly stain. Behind it stretched the front line, ditches full of prayer flags, rusted wire, amputated olive trees, and men who had forgotten what clean fabric felt like against the skin. Before it stretched the country beyond formal control. Villages, supply tracks, mule roads, dry riverbeds, old Roman stones, Ottoman bones, forgotten saints, and a dozen shifting little loyalties that every army claimed and none fully owned. The quarry I had been assigned was listed in the docket as Trooper Halim Vesk, age uncertain, former light infantry auxiliary in service to the heretic legions, attached most recently to a raiding band that had crossed the line south of Kalat Merin 3 weeks before. His band had struck 2 mule caravans and 1 parish convoy, had murdered a deacon and 7 drivers, had burned a storehouse used for lamp oil and preserved grain, and had vanished into the scrub before the local garrison could close. Of the 9 raiders, 6 were confirmed dead in a running engagement with Sultanate scouts. 2 had likely doubled back west. The last, Vesk, was believed to have broken north with stolen maps, code slips, and the names of settlements feeding materiel toward the Levant line. They told me he was no ordinary deserter. He had once been of the faithful, born near Antioch, baptized, tithed, and drilled beneath church banners until capture 2 years earlier in a collapsed salient. In captivity, he had turned, whether by torment, persuasion, or that softer corrosion men name survival when they do not wish to say cowardice. He had then served well enough among the heretics to be trusted with intelligence. That was the part that mattered. A runaway soldier can rob a farm, murder a traveler, foul a well. A runaway courier with maps can help unmake a sector. Captain Rowell of the screening post spread the paper maps on an ammunition crate while wind dragged dust through the chapel doorway and made the candle flames lean like reeds in current. "He'll need shelter," Rowell said. "Food. Somewhere with enough traffic to disappear into and enough fear to keep mouths shut. Deir el-Masra fits all three. Small village, but it sits on the track feeding stores down to the mule depots. Tavern there. Old Khan before the wars. Traders still use it when they dare. So do men who prefer no questions." "And the village priest?" I asked. Rowell gave me a look that meant the question was naive but forgivable. "Dead last winter, fever or poison depending who you ask, no replacement sent. Chapels shut, locals bury their own and keep to themselves. Ex-New Antioch settlers there from before the lines shifted. Levantines. A few Ottoman Christians. A few who claim whatever creed suits the company." He tapped the map. "We've lost lamp oil casks, rifle bolts, and medical spirits from caravans that passed near Deir el-Masra. Not enough to prove treachery. Enough to stink." I looked over the names marked on the requisition routes. St. Barakiel's Spur, Mule Relay 3, Deir el-Masra, Nahal Kedar Fork, Upper Store Caves. Small names carrying the burden of a great war. "Am I to seize him only?" I asked. "Or judge collaborators also?" Rowell rubbed his jaw. "Your writ grants latitude in the field, but hear me before zeal runs ahead of usefulness. We need the road intact more than we need a square full of public justice. Confirm the trooper. Confirm his contacts if you can. If the village is merely frightened, fright can be managed. If it's rotten, then cut. But know the difference first." That was sensible. Sensible orders often sound, in the mouth of weary officers, very much like pleas. I tucked the writ into the waxed sleeve inside my coat. "Has word of my order preceded me?" He laughed once without humor. "Brother, in these hills word of your order arrives before hoofprints. Expect no welcome." He was correct. The road to Deir el-Masra took me a day and a half on foot. I could have requisitioned a mule, but animals complain in ways the countryside notices. A lone pilgrim with ash on his shoulders and a staff in hand passes more easily than a mounted hunter with military tack. The Levant in that season was caught between spring promise and summer cruelty. Wild thyme grew in stubborn cracks between stones. Almond trees held their last blossoms in pockets where frost had not bitten them. The lower slopes were all dust, marl, and exposed roots, but higher up the cedar groves still breathed a cool, resinous dark that made a man remember the world had once been made for other purposes than war. Every few miles I passed ruins with competing histories. Roman mile markers carved over by Crusader prayers, Ottoman cistern caps split by shelling, shrines painted once in blue and white now masked by soot and bullet scars. Crows watched from broken lintels. Once I saw an anchorite shrine bell half buried in a washout, green with corrosion, impossible to move and too sacred to abandon, so someone had simply built a little cairn around it and set fresh thyme there. I slept one short night in the lee of a collapsed shepherd's wall, wrapped in my cloak, revolver tucked against my ribs, boots on. Before dawn, I woke to distant artillery from the south. Not the great rolling sermons of a set-piece barrage, but the occasional hard cough of gun pits correcting some local disagreement. The front is never silent in that part of the world. It mutters even in sleep. As I walked, I prayed the pilgrim offices, the litany of burning doors at sunrise, the ash psalm at noon, the 26 names of sanctified flame at dusk. Prayer on the road is part discipline, part counting measure, part company. It also keeps the mind from wandering toward old failures. Mine had a long trail to choose from. By the time I came within sight of Deir el-Masra on the second afternoon, dust had turned the hem of my wraps the same color as the track. The village sat in a shallow bowl between cedar uplands and terraced slopes gone mostly to weed. 40 or 50 buildings at a glance, perhaps more if one counted the lower lean-tos in the slum quarter near the dry stream bed. Stone walls, flat roofs, some patched with scavenged tin. A half-collapsed chapel stood on the eastern rise, its bell gone, its painted saint faces weather-blind. Beside the main square was the old khan Captain Rewell had mentioned, now functioning as tavern, inn, stable, gossip market, and probably smuggling exchange. A cracked cistern dominated the square. Chickens scratched in its shade. Laundry hung from lines between windows like surrendered flags. There were children watching me before I reached the first houses. Children always see armed strangers first. They do not stare as adults do. They assess. They judge if running is wiser than curiosity. An old woman carrying a basket of onions made the sign against evil when she saw the Ember Cross brand stitched on my shoulder wrap. Not the sign of blessing. The other one. Thumb to palm, fingers hooked inward. A warding gesture. Good, I thought. Honest dislike is easier to navigate than false hospitality. I entered by the southern lane and paused where I could study the village without seeming to. Donkeys tethered in the shade, a water cellar, a cobbler's bench, 2 men repairing harness straps, 3 more unloading sacks from a cart with new Antioch quartermaster marks half scraped from the cloth, a pair of local auxiliaries with old rifles too mismatched to have come from official stores, and at the tavern entrance, leaning under the awning with cups in hand, 4 hard-looking men whose clothes were local enough until you studied the belts, the boots, the way they stood with weight on the edges of their feet. Mercenaries, hired blades or caravan guards, men used to violence but not to uniform. One of them saw me looking. He smiled without warmth. The tavern of Deir el-Masra had once been a caravanserai built around an open courtyard. The old arches still held in places, though one whole corner had collapsed and been patched with rough cedar beams. The common room smelled of wine, anise, damp wool, old wood smoke, and frying onions. There was a brass lamp tree above the central tables, blackened by years of soot. Behind the counter stood a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard, rolled sleeves, and the grave eyes of someone who has lived too long in a road town and learned that every customer brings a possible disaster with him. This was Elias Haddad, though I did not know his name yet. Conversation thinned when I entered. It did not stop. Villages near the front learn to keep speaking when danger comes in. Silence is more revealing than noise. I ordered water first, then wine cut with twice as much water, and paid in full sight so no one could later say I expected devotion to compensate for my thirst. Elias set the cup before me with professional neutrality. "You seek a bed?" he asked. Perhaps. Perhaps only a meal and news. News costs more than stew. Then begin with stew. That drew a few low laughs from the room. A useful start. Better to be disliked and competent than disliked and pompous. I took a table near the side wall where I could see both door and stairs. The mercenaries under the awning came in one by one over the next quarter hour, as if separately by chance, which was almost insulting in its clumsiness. They settled 2 tables away. Their leader was thick-necked, dark-bearded, with a scar beneath one eye and an old cavalry saber at his hip polished more carefully than the rest of him. Beside him sat a younger man with a split eyebrow and restless hands, the second in command by the way he watched the leader after every remark. The other 2 were broader and slower, labor-muscled, one with a missing little finger on his left hand. I ate lentil stew with lamb fat floating on top and listened. A mule train had been delayed east of the Fork. A parish factor from the south had paid too much for dried figs. A widow's son had joined a labor corps near Antioch. 2 goats were missing. Someone had seen signal lights in the hills 3 nights ago. That last point changed the shape of my attention, but it was offered casually and met with shrugs. Either nobody cared or nobody wished to care publicly. When I had nearly finished the bowl, the scarred mercenary rose and brought his cup to my table without invitation. "Pilgrim," he said, "you wear a bad badge for this village." I looked up at him. "Then the village may look elsewhere if it dislikes the view." A few heads turned. His men smiled at that. They had hoped for timidity. Defiance promised them entertainment. "Do you know Alcara?" he asked. I knew enough. "I know the name. My mother's sister lived there." He leaned one hand on the table. "3 women burned by your Ember Cross judges, 1 for herbs, 1 for dreams, 1 because she cursed a collector when he took her winter grain. Perhaps they found devils in the smoke. Perhaps they only smelled themselves. Either way, folks here don't pour welcome wine for ash-coated zealots." His companion with the split eyebrows spat on the floor. "Your lot call us half-faith hill dogs. Then you ask why we don't sing your hymns." This was the moment an unwiser man would have reached for doctrine. I reached for the truth, though not the whole of it. "If those women were innocent," I said, "then whoever judged them has an account to settle before God. I was not there. I did not light the pyre. I am here for another matter." The leader barked a laugh. "Hear that? The fire says it wasn't this flame." "What matter?" asked the younger one. I finished my drink before answering. "A heretic raider came through these hills. I follow him. If he has friends here, they endanger more than your pride." That changed several faces in the room. Not openly, just enough. Fear, anger, calculation. One of the mercenaries glanced very slightly toward the back stairs. I marked it. The leader saw me mark it and decided things had gone far enough. He slammed his cup down. "No preaching, no accusations. Eat and move on, Pilgrim." "Or?" I asked. The second-in-command sighed as if disappointed by necessity. Then they came at me. "There are fights a man wins by speed, fights he wins by surprise, and fights he loses because he mistakes a public room for a chapel court where symbols still carry weight. I made that mistake in Deir el-Masra." The younger one moved first, quick as a ferret, kicking my table edge up into my ribs as the leader swung from the left. I turned enough that the blow struck my cheekbone rather than my temple, but the room rang white all the same. I drove my shoulder into the table, toppled it between us, got half upright, and caught the third man with the iron butt of my staff hard across the knee. He screamed and went sideways into another table, sending cups and a lamp crashing. If the room had stayed only them and me, I might have bloodied too badly enough to restore caution. But tavern fights are opportunistic storms. Hands appeared from nowhere. Someone smashed a bottle across my back. Someone else caught my wrist before I could free the concealed spike in the staff core. The leader closed in and hammered my stomach with 2 short body blows that emptied all the air from me. I got the staff up again in both hands and cracked his lip and 1 tooth loose. Then the split-browed lieutenant hit me behind the ear with a stool leg, and the floor came up too fast. I remember boots, shouts in Arabic, Levantine Greek, and rough New Antioch trade dialect. The stink of spilled anise, my own blood in my mouth tasting hot and penny bright. A woman's voice cursing the whole room to sterility. A heavy object striking wood. Then cold air. They threw me out into the street. I landed on one shoulder in dust and sour runoff beside the tavern trough. My staff came after me. The leader stepped into the doorway above and pointed down with his cup. "Take your ash elsewhere," he said. Blood from his cut lip dripped onto his beard. "And if you ask questions about strangers in this village again, ask them from outside the walls." The door slammed. Laughter followed. Not universal. Enough. I lay there longer than I should admit. Pride hurts in ways fists do not. Eventually the light changed. Evening moved in. Someone stood over me. I rolled, hand on knife. "Easy," said the tavern keeper. "Elias." If I meant to finish you, I'd have done it before you found the blade. He and an older woman with forearms like carved roots got me to my feet and around the side of the tavern into a low storeroom that smelled of straw, old soap, and vinegar. There was a cot there, a basin, and a shuttered slit of a window. "Why help me?" I asked once my head stopped tilting. Ilias shrugged. "You paid for the stew, and they broke furniture I liked." The older woman snorted. "And because if they kill a church pilgrim on your doorstep, every fool with a seal ring will come sniffing through the place for 6 months." "That too," he admitted. Her name was Mariam. She cleaned the cut behind my ear, wrapped my ribs with a strip of linen that had once been a flour sack, and informed me in a tone fit for children and idiots that if I coughed blood, she wanted to know before dawn. Night took the room by degrees, while pain settled into its proper seats: jaw, ribs, shoulder, spine, the back of my skull. Ilias brought broth and coarse bread. He lingered by the door. "You truly hunt a heretic?" he asked. "Yes." "A specific one?" "Yes." "Then you are not here to make examples of villagers." I hesitated. Honesty is a tool like any other. Use it too rarely and it rusts, too often, and someone takes it from your hand. "If I find treachery," I said, "I do not ignore it, but I was sent for the trooper." He looked at me a long time. Outside, in the courtyard beyond the wall, cups clinked and someone plucked at a one-string rebec. "Sleep," he said at last. "The village is uglier by lamplight." Then he closed the door. Pain wakes a man often. So does training. Near midnight I woke because the tavern had gone too quiet. Road taverns are never silent for long. Someone snores. Someone pisses in the yard. A mule stamps. A drunk sings at the moon. This was different. The common room above had reached that held-breath hush I had heard before ambushes. I lay still and listened. Steps in the passage. Soft. Careful. A door opening. Another shutting. Then, from outside beyond the rear wall, a faint scrape of boot on stone. I rose slowly, every wrapped rib complaining, and crossed to the shutter. Through a crack, I saw the rear yard washed in thin moonlight. One figure moved from the stable shadow toward the lane, compact, hooded, carrying something under one arm. He paused once to look back, and for an instant moonlight caught the line of his face. Not the leader, not the split-browed lieutenant either. Then another shape detached itself from the deeper shade near the water trough and followed at distance. That second figure was the lieutenant. So, one sneaking out, another shadowing him. Distrust within the band. Useful. I took up my staff, carbine and knife belt, eased the storeroom latch, and stepped into the yard. The air smelled of coal dust, wet cedar, and distant hearths. Ilias appeared from nowhere beside the wall, as quiet as a priest's bad thought. "You should be in bed," he murmured. "One of your guests is walking too carefully," I said. "They do that. Tonight, I care." He squinted past me toward the lane. "That was Yusuf. Came with the Mercenaries 10 days ago. Barely drinks. Pays in silver clipped from bad coins. Never lets anyone clean his room. The others say he's from Tyre. The others lie badly." "And the one following him?" "Sammy, the loud one who helped break your face." A pause. "He was sorry after. Not enough to stop. Just enough to look embarrassed while doing it." I slid into the lane. "If I am not back by dawn, tell no one which way I went." "I was planning not to help you," Ilias said. "Good, continue." He almost smiled. The woods above Deir el Mazra were cedar only by old memory. Enough trees remained to justify the name, but the groves had been thinned for fuel, trench timber, and siege engines long before my birth. What stood there now were dark pillars among scrub oak, thorn, loose rock, and pockets of old snowmelt damp hidden from the day. Moonlight netted through branches in narrow silver strips. The village lay behind me as scattered amber points below. Tracking at night is faith married to patience. You do not see as much as you infer. A displaced stone, fresh scrape on bark, one boot print with sharper heel edge than the village footwear. I followed Yusuf by restraint, not haste, keeping him just near enough to hear when he disturbed brush. Ahead and to my left, now and then, I caught the fainter signs of Sammy doing the same. If he was spying on his own comrade for blackmail, profit, or suspicion, I could use him. If he was part of a test designed to flush out anyone watching, I was already in it. The path bent toward a dry gully where broken columns lay half-buried, the remains of some estate or shrine older than the village. There, Yusuf stopped. I dropped behind a cedar trunk and slowed my breath. A low whistle came from the gully, twice short, once long. Another answered. Shapes emerged from darkness below. 5 men, then a 6th. Not villagers. They wore the scavenged mix of frontier raiders, patched cloaks over mismatched armor plates, wrapped rifle slings, curved knives, one carrying a short-barreled trench shotgun with devotional graffiti scratched out and replaced by infernal sigils. Their leader had a heretic's half-brand burned up the side of his neck, visible in the moonlight like old black wax. One more figure sat propped against a stone, wounded or merely lazy, I could not yet tell. Yusuf stepped down to them and pulled back his hood. I saw then the jawline from the sketch docket, the scar beside the mouth, and the flattened bridge of the nose broken years ago and badly healed. Halim Vesk. He had shaved his beard to change his shape. He had darkened his hands with walnut stain to pass more easily among locals. But a hunted man always resembles the description most when he believes himself safe. Sammy had crept up on the opposite ridge and saw it too. I heard him suck in breath through his teeth. Below, Vesk unwrapped the bundle under his arm. Papers. One of the raiders lit a hooded lamp and the yellow flare showed map edges. "Relay cave here," Vesk said in a voice lower than I expected. Native New Antioch consonants, but worn rough by months among heretics. He tapped the map. "Mule stores every 6th day. Lamp oil, rifle parts, salt beef, sacramental wax, 2 crates of ampules last week. Strike here and here, pull back through the north ravine, then circle toward the village after dawn as caravan guards. No one suspects what leaves with a sympathy story and blood on the shirt." "And the poison?" Vesk produced a small packet wrapped in oilcloth. "In the room by the stream bed. Enough to foul cistern and 2 wine casks. Not instant. Better. Makes them sicken by evening and blame bad water or providence. While they're weak, we take the road clean." The heretic shotgunner laughed softly. "You said this village was useful." "It is," Vesk said. "Their mercenaries are vain, suspicious, and easy to steer. I fed them a story about church taxmen and witch burners and let them do the rest. If the pilgrim I heard about reached the village, they would blood him for me before I had to lift a hand." Sammy made a tiny, involuntary sound. Horror, guilt, or offended pride. Perhaps all 3. Veska's head snapped up toward the ridge. He had the hunter's ears still. I moved first, not by choice, by necessity. Once a room knows you are in it, the argument changes. I stood from cover and shouted the alarm litany of the road patrols, the old crusader call adapted over centuries into something every half-faithful village still recognized. "Heresy in the woods! To arms! Wake the faithful!" Then I fired my revolver at Vesk. The shot took him high in the shoulder and spun him back into the stone. The woods exploded. The first seconds of any fight are a contest between surprise and comprehension. Mine bought me only a little. One raider dropped at my second shot, Throat opened red-black. Then the others scattered hard, diving for rocks and trunks as muzzle flashes tore the night apart. A rifle ball slammed bark into my face from the cedar trunk I had just abandoned. Another clipped the iron cap of my staff with a bright, angry spark. Across the gully, Sammy yelled something obscene about betrayal and opened fire downhill on the heretics. So that settled his allegiance, at least for the moment. I threw myself behind a broken column as the shotgunner loosed both barrels toward my last muzzle flash. Stone chips slashed my cheek. Pain in my ribs turned sharp and wet, though whether I was newly hit or only tearing the bruised flesh I could not tell. "Vesk!" I shouted. "Halim Vesk! In the name of the true church, yield and be judged!" He answered with a laugh so raw it sounded near madness. "Judged? By Ember Cross Carrion? I'd sooner kneel to hell itself." "Perhaps you already have. And found it honest?" There it was, the heretic creed stripped to bone. Not glory, not power, honesty. I had heard versions before from defectors and captured trench apostates. Better a monster that says it will devour you than a priest who calls teeth mercy. It is a dangerous argument because now and then, on certain ugly nights, part of it is true. Gunfire crackled from the ridge where Sammy had taken cover. One raider screamed. Another shouted to flank me. I heard boots sliding through the scrub to my right and drove my pilgrim staff low into the dark as a shape lunged in. The iron tips smashed a shin. The man fell close enough that I saw the devotionals nailed into his coat lining, little brass infernal seals stitched where saints' medals once sat. He swung a knife. I trapped his wrist under the staff and put my broad blade into the hollow beneath his jaw. Hot blood ran over my hand. The others pulled back a little then. Men do that when close violence reminds them there is skin under all theology. Below us, toward the village, bells began ringing. Not church bells. Deir el Masra had none left. These were pots struck with iron, mule gongs, a smith's plate beaten with hammer. Alarm improvised from what remained. Good, I thought. Ilias had chosen a side, or at least a direction. Then Vesk called out in the darkness, "Fall back to the lower cut! Burn the papers!" No, I could not let him vanish again. I dropped from the column and charged downhill. That rush should have killed me. Perhaps in cleaner wars it would have, but confusion is a sacrament of its own in the cedar dark. A raider fired and hit one of his own as I came through the smoke of their lamp, now overturned and guttering in dry needles. Another swung the trench shotgun at me like a club after spending both shells. I took the blow on my left shoulder and felt something there tear like old canvas. My staff came up under his chin with all the strength I had left in my back. Teeth snapped. He fell backward over the oil lamp, and flame climbed his beard in an instant. I vaulted the broken stone where Vesk had been, and found only blood, map scraps, and one cartridge pouch. He had gone toward the lower cut, a narrow ravine overgrown with scrub. I heard him sliding through shale ahead. So did Sammy, who stumbled down from his ridge red-faced, eyes wild. "Pilgrim!" he shouted. "By God's wounds, it was Yusef! It was him all along!" "Congratulations on your revelation," I said, and shoved past him. He actually followed. Behind us, more shots sounded from the village trail, different in tone from the raiders' pieces. Older rifles, black powder coughs, one heavier New Antioch long gun report still carrying discipline in the crack. Ex-soldiers. Ilias had not merely raised alarm, he had raised memory. We reached the lower cut just as Vesk and two remaining heretics tried to cross toward the north ravine. One of them turned to cover the retreat and fired from the hip. The shot smashed into the stone near Sammy's head. He went down flat with a cry and did not rise. I knelt, braced my carbine on a rock, and fired once. The covering raider folded at the waist and vanished into thorn. The last one with Vesk began dragging him by the uninjured arm. Vesk was leaving a dark ribbon on the stones from the wound in his shoulder. He twisted to fire a pistol back at me. The ball passed close enough to flick my ear. I fired again and hit the dragger somewhere in the lower back. He pitched forward. Vesk rolled free, cursed, and crawled into shadow. Then the reinforcements arrived through the trees. Ilias came first with an old service rifle and a lantern hooded almost shut. Behind him were 6 men in patched coats and mismatched gear, all too old for current line service and too quick in movement to have forgotten it. Retired New Antioch troopers, just as the tale later told it. Men put aside by age, wounds, or village necessity, still keeping their rifles hidden under bed frames and flour bins because they did not trust any sentry enough to surrender them. One wore the faded remains of a line infantry greatcoat. Another carried a sapper's short entrenching axe polished bright at the edge. A third had wrapped prayer ribbons around the stock of an old bolt-action so many times the wood beneath hardly showed. Their leader was a woman in her 50s with one clouded eye and a cartridge belt crossing a wool dress. She nodded once at me as if assessing a weather report. "Name's Sergeant Hester," she said. "Retired, despite God's repeated hints. Where are the bastards?" "Ahead in the cut," I said. "Then stop bleeding at me and move." We moved. The fight in the North Ravine is the part people later turned into a tavern song. Songs lie by simplification. Let me tell it as it was. The ravine was narrow, choked with cedar roots and old stone terraces collapsed inward over generations. Moonlight barely touched the floor. You fought there by muzzle flash and intuition. The heretics had perhaps 4 effective fighters left, including Vesk, all desperate, all trapped between the village men coming from below and the slope guards we now set above. We split fast. Hester sent 2 of her veterans up the left bank to fire down. I took center with Ilyas and one broad-shouldered ex-sapper named Joram. 2 others looped right. Sammy, blood on his face and shame in every movement, limped after us with a captured rifle he handled like a man trying to make amends faster than the world permits. From behind a terrace wall, the heretics opened hard. Joram spun and dropped with a bullet through the upper arm. Hester's veterans answered from the ridge and pinned one raider long enough for me to close 15 paces through brush and stone. I reached the wall, shoved the staff through a firing gap, and felt it strike soft. The raider cried out. I vaulted after the blow and landed nearly on top of him. He was younger than I expected, beard scarcely more than shadow. Around his neck hung a church crucifix, inverted and recarved with infernal script. He tried to spit in my face while reaching for a grenade tucked in his coat. I broke his wrist against the wall before he could pull the pin. To my right, the Tavern Mercenaries arrived. I had half expected a bullet in my back when I heard them. Instead, the scarred leader stormed into the ravine roaring like a man who had discovered he had been made a fool in front of witnesses and meant to answer that insult with violence. Behind him came 2 of his surviving men, and Sammy's absence among them told them enough. They had learned who Yusef truly was, or enough of it to smell the same shame he did. The leader fired both barrels of a hunting gun at a muzzle flash in the brush and shouted, "For the faithful, you lying dogs!" It was not eloquent, but it was timely. One of Hester's veterans barked a laugh. Well, that's new. The split in the battle closed. We were one side now. Amid the firing, the mercenary second in command, not Sammy, who was lower on the slope, but the quiet, heavy man called Ferris, whom I had scarcely noticed in the tavern, came up beside me, breathing hard. He had a burn scar along his neck I had mistaken before for shadow. In the chaos, his eyes shone almost fever bright. "Brother," he said, not taking his gaze off the ravine ahead. "Forgive us. We thought the Pilgrim was the danger. We were blind and proud." A ball snapped past and struck stone between us. "Survive first," I said. "Confess later." "No," he said. "I need the words now." He thrust something into my free hand, a bottle stuffed with rag, sloshing with lamp oil and spirits. A Molotov, though we would not have called it that in my youth. A poor man's grenade, a tavern keeper's war theology. "What are you doing?" I asked. He smiled strangely. Peaceful, almost. "Atonement before courage runs out." He snatched the bottle back, struck a taper to the rag from a smoldering branch, and before I could seize him, he ran. He ran straight into the knot of heretics clustered behind the final terrace wall where Vesk had made his stand. The half-branded leader shouted, warning. Too late. Ferris vaulted the wall, bellowing a prayer so old and local I only caught half of it. and hurled himself bodily into them as he smashed the burning bottle against the stones. Fire bloomed white-orange in the ravine. Spirit flames run greedily over wool, oilcloth, beard, paper, and fear. The blast was not large by artillery standards, not even notable by trench standards, but in that narrow, root-bound gut of earth it became everything at once. Light, heat, screaming, smoke, and men stumbling blind into rifle fire. One heretic emerged burning, and Hester shot him twice through the chest. Another tumbled over the wall with his hands fused black around a knife. I struck him down almost by reflex. The half-branded leader vanished in the flames, and Halim Vesk, hair and coat smoking, crawled from the edge of the blaze, trying to drag himself toward the north path with one hand. I reached him before anyone else. He rolled onto his back when my shadow fell over him. Firelight made a demon mask of his face. He was not yet dying. Men with conviction are annoyingly durable. "Judge me, then," he rasped, blood bubbling at one corner of his mouth. "You crossed half the Levant for it." I planted the iron-capped staff across his chest and knelt despite my ribs shrieking at the motion. Around us the ravine was still chaos. Men stamping flame, shouting for water, calling names of the wounded, one horse somewhere below screaming in panic from the smell. "Why this village?" I asked. He laughed and coughed black. "Because roads win wars. Not trenches, not saints' bones, roads. Poison the cistern, cut the mule track, torch the relay caves. Your pious line starves in a week and calls it divine testing. Who sent you? Names are for survivors." I pressed harder with the staff. His wounded shoulder leaked through the cloth. "You were born to the faith. I was born to collectors, priests, and officers who blessed every theft as necessity." His eyes fixed on my shoulder badge. "Men like you burn widows and call the smoke a ladder to heaven. At least the heretics know what they are." There it was again. Honest hell against hypocrite heaven. I wish I could tell you I answered him with a perfect line of doctrine, some holy thunder that settled every doubt. War rarely affords such theater. What I said was this: if all you've learned is that hypocrisy exists, then you've learned only the easiest part of evil. He stared at me, perhaps expecting more. I had none, so I judged him with iron instead. The blessed spike concealed in my staff came free with one twist. I drove it under his sternum and into the heart. He jerked once and was still. That was the end of Halim Vesk, trooper, traitor, courier, and nearly the undoing of Deir el-Masra. It was not the end of the night. We spent another hour in the ravine putting out flames and finding who remained alive. Faris did not. They found him collapsed against the terrace stones with both hands burned to bone and half his chest opened by shot or shrapnel from some panicked discharge during the blast. His face had survived enough to be recognizable. Someone had closed his eyes. Sammy knelt beside the body and wept without restraint, which in men of that breed is usually the truest apology available. Of the heretics, only one lingered badly wounded, the youth with the recarved crucifix. Hester wanted answers from him. He gave none worth the effort and died before dawn with his teeth clenched against every offered sip of water. The villagers came up in waves once the firing ceased. First the brave, then the curious, then the relatives of the brave and curious. Lanterns made the cedars look like cathedral pillars streaked with soot. Women hauled blankets and water skins. One old man with half an ear collected weapons into a mule pannier with professional efficiency. The village priest's absence was palpable. In any healthier place there would have been someone to speak the sanctioned words. In Deir el-Masra, there were only fragments, Arabic prayers to saints, New Antioch military commendations muttered over corpses, old Levantine funeral lines older than either empire. I added the pilgrim's final ash blessing over Faris, despite the looks it drew from some of the villagers. At dawn, we limped back down. Elias walked beside me carrying my carbine because I no longer trusted my left shoulder not to drop it. Hester marched on the other side as if escorting a prisoner she had not yet decided whether to respect. Sammy and the scarred mercenary leader bore Ferris between them on a shutter used as stretcher. Behind came the others with the wounded and the captured papers salvaged from the ravine edge before the flames took them all. Deir el Masra, in dawn light, looked smaller than before, as villages do after they have nearly died. Smoke rose from cook fires, from the tavern chimney, from one roof where a lantern had toppled in the night and singed the matting. No one went about ordinary tasks. Everyone watched us return. Inside the tavern courtyard, Hester set 2 boys to boiling water and 1 old widow to sorting papers by dryness. I sat finally, because not sitting had become vanity. Miriam reappeared, swore at the state of my bandages, and unpacked me like damaged goods. "You tore everything I wrapped," she said. "I was busy. Bleeding is not an occupation." She pushed me onto a bench and reset the shoulder with a brutality I respected more than kindness. Meanwhile, the papers from Vesk's bundle were laid out on a table weighted by cups. Maps, route sketches, a list of supply timings written in cipher that matched enough quartermaster notation for Hester to begin cursing intelligently, and from the slum quarter room by the stream bed, discovered after Sammy admitted which room Yusuf had rented, 2 packets of powder sealed in waxed goat bladder, a stoppered bottle of clear additive that smelled faintly bitter, and a rough plan of the village cistern, the tavern cellar, and the mule pen. Poison, exactly as Vesk had boasted. When they opened the rented room properly, they found more. Spare identity tokens, local scarves stained with walnut to alter complexion, counterfeit caravan chits, scraps of infernal devotional text burned halfway in the brazier, and beneath the sleeping mat a second map showing the relay caves Captain Rowell had feared for. Deir el Masra had not merely been a hiding place, it had been a staging post. I remember looking at the cistern plan and feeling, more strongly than triumph, the cold aftertaste of nearly. Nearly the casks dosed, nearly the mule route cut, nearly the village blamed for its own sickness, nearly a front line starving one caravan at a time while officers argued over causes with clean hands. Wars are full of victories measured mainly by disasters that failed to happen. By late morning, Captain Rowell's riders arrived from St. Barakiel's spur, alerted by the alarm fires Hester had ordered lit on the ridge at first light. Soldiers changed the feeling of a village immediately. Backs straighten, lies rearrange themselves, old resentments put on polite coats. Rewell dismounted in a swirl of dust, took one look at my face, the bodies laid in the shade, the captured maps, and said, "You look terrible. Good work." "You always did know how to comfort," Hester told him. They knew each other, of course. Every frontier between formal line and informal survival is held together by old acquaintances, former sergeants, cousin marriages, grudges, and unpaid favors. We gave depositions in the tavern common room while Miriam bullied everyone into drinking broth. Sammy confessed his role in beating me and in ignoring several signs about Yusuf. The scarred leader, whose name was Nabil, admitted his own hatred of the Ember Cross had made him too eager to believe any story that humiliated a pilgrim. He also said, with rough dignity, that he had fought for the faith when the truth became plain and would answer for the earlier folly before whatever authority chose to hear it. Captain Rowell looked at me. The Writ's latitude hung between us. Years before, I might have chosen a harsher ending for them. Public rods, brands, confiscations, perhaps one hanging if I felt doctrine and deterrence demanded theater. The order had trained my instincts that way. Instead, I asked questions. Who had rented the room? Which supplies had been stolen? Who in the village had knowingly aided the poison plot? The answers were untidy and human. Nabil's company had been manipulated, yes. Yusuf, Vesk, had fed them stories, paid generously, and played on inherited grievance. One widow in the slum quarter had rented the room for coin and silence, not knowing the whole scheme. A carter had looked away while crates moved at night because his daughter needed medicine. One boy had carried messages thinking them love notes. No ring of conscious heretics, no nest to purge cleanly, only fear, bitterness, and greed exploited by one practiced infiltrator. Captain Rowell, to his credit, understood the value of distinction. The widow paid a fine in labor and stores. The carter surrendered his wagon for military use 6 months. The boy was whipped lightly by his own uncle before anyone else could make a legal spectacle of it. Nabil and Sammy turned over their weapons for inspection, swore provisional service on the Deir El Masra road watch, and buried Faris with village honors and the sign of the cross. It was not tidy justice. It was better. Tidy justice is often just laziness in ceremonial dress. As for the poison and papers, Ruel sealed them for the spur and sent 2 riders immediately toward the relay caves to warn the mule trains. When official business ended, Ilyas poured wine for the room. He paused beside me with the pitcher. "Will your order hear of this?" he asked quietly. "Probably. And of Faris. If I write it. Then write he died for the faithful after behaving like an ass. That is the most accurate version." Agreed. He filled my cup. No one toasted me. That was right, too. I was not beloved. I had arrived wearing old smoke. One useful night cannot unburn the memories of Alcara or any other village my order had scarred, but neither did anyone spit at my feet when I drank. In frontier country, that can count as grace. I remained in Deir El Masra 2 more nights while my shoulder settled and Captain Rewell's clerks copied the seized maps. During those nights I learned more of the village than I had while hunting through it. Hester had once served in the 3rd New Antioch line, same broad institution if not the same company as men from a dozen tales now buried under other fronts. She had retired after losing an eye to shell splinter and a son to fever in the same month come north to help a cousin with terraced fields, and simply never left. Joram, the ex-sapper, had built half the reinforced cellars in the village. Mariam had delivered most of the people now old enough to complain about her shouting. Ilyas had kept the tavern through 3 occupations, 2 famines, 6 tax regimes, and 1 locust year by the simple policy of feeding anyone who paid and some who could not, so long as they did not kill on his floorboards. On the 2nd evening, Sammy came to me in the courtyard carrying Faris's scorched prayer beads. "He asked forgiveness from you," Sammy said. His bruises had yellowed around the eyes. "Do you give it?" I turned the beads once in my hand. Olive pits blackened by smoke, cord nearly burned through. "I am not the only one he wronged," I said. "I know, but you were the first." I considered. Around us, the courtyard murmured with ordinary life returning. Bowls, spoons, someone laughing too loudly because they were still relieved to be alive. "He chose rightly when it cost him," I said. "That counts." Sammy swallowed. "And me. You are alive. That is more burden than reward. Carry it properly and perhaps one day the answer changes in your favor." He nodded as if struck. Sometimes plain words do more work than condemnation. Before dawn on the 3rd day, I climbed the rise to the ruined chapel east of the village. The roof had fallen in over the nave, leaving only the apse and part of one wall with a saint's painted hand still visible. Someone had been leaving fresh oil in a cracked lamp there despite the place being formally abandoned. Faith, like water, prefers cracks. I knelt among weeds and broken plaster and prayed not the Ember Cross offices, but the older common prayer every line soldier knows, for roads to hold, for water not to fail, for the names of the dead to be remembered somewhere not made by men. I added Faris, though his name would surprise several registrars. I added Deir El Masra. I added reluctantly myself. When I rose, the sun had touched the cedar tops and turned them copper. For one moment, the village below looked almost peaceful, as if peace were not merely the pause between hungers. I left that morning with my shoulder bound, Veska's identity tokens sealed in my pouch, and Captain Rewell's report for the command post. The road south seemed longer than before. Success usually does that. Once the hunt ends, the weight of what nearly failed catches up. I was 2 miles out when I looked back and saw a figure on the tavern roof lift an arm. I could not tell whether it was Ilias, Sami, Hester, or some child merely shooing birds. I lifted my staff in answer anyway. You may want a cleaner moral than the one I can offer. You may want the Trench Pilgrim vindicated, the villagers chastened, the mercenaries redeemed, the heretic denounced and silenced by superior holiness. But Trench Crusade does not often give clean endings. It gives roads kept open by damaged people making one right choice too late to save everyone and just in time to save enough. It gives villages that distrust the same institutions they still depend on. It gives faith worn thin by memory and hatred interrupted by necessity. It gives a pilgrim from a hated order one chance to do justice without adding more smoke to the valley. Deir el Masra remained on the supply route after that. The cistern was not poisoned. The mule caravans kept moving. Lamp oil reached the trenches. Rifle bolts reached the line. Medical spirits reached dressing stations where boys with no idea where Deir el Masra even lay on a map lived an hour longer because of it, or a day, or enough to be carried west instead of buried east. No medal marks such arithmetic. No hymn names all its contributors, but the road held. In this war, that is sometimes as close to a miracle as God permits.